Good evening, everyone. Happy to have you. Very excited about tonight's program. My name is Jonathan Gales. I'm professor and chair of the Department of African American Studies, soon to be Africana Studies at Georgia State University. And I want to thank our partners on the front end, Auburn Avenue Research Library, such phenomenal partners for all the work that they do. And I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Multicultural Center at Georgia State University and William Brito and all the fine folks there that have supported this program. And I'm excited because I get a chance to introduce not only my colleague, but my friend, my co-conspirator, and a phenomenal scholar, Dr. Stephanie Evans. Dr. Evans and I became chairs together in 2019, pre-pandemic, all those many years ago. And she is currently professor of Black Women's Studies and serves as the director of the Institute for Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Georgia State University. She is also, of course, affiliate faculty with the Department of African American Studies, as well as in the Center for the Study of Stress, Trauma, and Resilience. She is an award-winning scholar from a number of different universities. Her research has taken her across the globe, and she has published a number of different books, including her first book, Black Passports, Travel Memoirs as a Tool for Youth Empowerment. Her second book, Black Women in the Ivory Tower, 1850 to 1954, an Intellectual History. And her most recent book, dare I say the masterpiece that was just released the first day of this month, March 1st, Black Women's Yoga History, Memoirs of Inner Peace, which is published by SUNY Press. And I could offer you an hour-long introduction, but I am, like many of you that have reached out in advance of this program, super excited to hear Dr. Evans talk about this work, this journey. And so community members, I want to welcome Dr. Stephanie Evans.
All right, all right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Gales and African American Studies, definitely Lakita Bonnet-Bailey, Dr. Bonnet-Bailey, for reaching out with this invite, and William Brito and all of the co-sponsors, and of course, Auburn Avenue Research Library. It's such a loss to not be in the physical space, but I'm so grateful to be connected to the community at GSU, and grateful for this invitation to share my work. And definitely shout out to Morris Gardner, as you know, it's the people who are putting these things together. Like, we all have so much to do, so I don't take for granted the, you know, the technical aspect, the organizing, the advertising. But when I got the email from Morris Gardner, and it had Robin Kelly, a reference to Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams, it really kind of brought me back to what we're all, you know, what we all are here to do and talk about, this concept of freedom. And for me, how this work has been freeing in so many ways. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And start this PowerPoint here. Excellent. Okay, well, first again, thank you so much for this invite. I'm basically going to walk through the book that just dropped 9 days ago, and really kind of talk about the culmination of how this is a culmination of the earlier work that I've done. So this is Black women's historical wellness is a main concept that I'm advancing, that as someone who is interested in Black women's intellectual history and Black women's memoirs in particular, this book is the groundwork for an idea, right? A freedom dream of looking at Black women's history from the lens of wellness instead of the lens of illness. So if you would like to visit blackwomensyogahistory.net, there are a lot of resources there that I've collected over the years, including a library of YouTube videos of my favorite yoga classes. So if you're new to yoga, or if you're experienced, There's a lot of resources there, including YouTube videos for classes. The book cover is artwork by Annie Lee, who is a Chicago artist. She's an iconic African-American woman artist. And I chose this work, My Cup Runneth Over, because most of the artwork that we know from Annie Lee, or the most prominent image by Annie Lee, is Blue Monday. And so I looked at Blue Monday, which is kind of a similar image of a Black woman in a white gown with a blue background. And it was a self-portrait of Annie Lee when she was working for the railroads in Chicago and having to get up at 5:30 in the morning. But she also painted this picture called My Cup Runneth Over. And you see in the picture, you know, the sunshine, a Black woman sitting down with a text with plants, and she made herself a pot of tea with some lemon and lime. And so this really represented for me the artwork that I wanted to portray, because yoga is about holistic health, mind, body, and spirit. And usually when we think about yoga, we're thinking about the yoga postures, the asanas, the physicality of yoga. But what I'm doing is looking at yoga as it's intended to, as we know, the mind, body, and spirit unity. I'd also like to make a plug for a class. I'll be teaching Black Women in Health, which is cross-listed with African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies this fall, hashtag historical wellness. And the goal of the class is to identify historical and cultural strategies for sustainable well-being. So what you see here is a picture of many of the authors that I'll talk about in this work. Elders, Black women elders pre-1975 and post-1975, from Harriet Jacobs, the Delaney sisters, Eartha Kitt, Rosa Parks, Jan Willis, and Tina Turner, who are all elders who are above 70, to Patrice Gaines and others, all the way to Adisha Sahida Simmons, who's an anti-sexual violence activist. And so we see that African-American women from ages of 50 to 70 and 70 to 100. These are historical practices, these are contemporary practices, and we'll explore these using sources from like the Center for Disease Control, American Public Health Association, Boston University's Black Women's Health Study. So it will be a research-based class where students are engaging this particular work on health and wellness, but also expanding and creating what we know to be historical wellness and historical wellness practices. So my work is, my research area is Black women's intellectual history. And I really focus on empowerment education. As was said, my first book was Black Women in the Ivory Tower, and I was looking at Black women's memoirs as they write about higher education. So Anna Julia Cooper, Mary McLeod Bethune, Septima Clark, and the first 100 years of Black women in higher education really taught me how to be a professor. And so I'm drawing on that same history with this yoga book, because it's looking at Black women's memoirs, as I have done all along with social justice education, with travel, looking to memoirs as guides. Memoirs are mentors. And as Maya Angelou wrote, memoirs are letters to our daughters. There are a couple of different frameworks about how that shape how I'm approaching memoir. For example, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot talked about in the art and science of portraiture that memoirs capture complexity of human life. And Patricia Bell Scott in Flat-Footed Truths, which is one of the first collections of Black women's life writing, says that memoirs tell truths that nourish the next generation. And Deborah Gray White in in Black women's history, and shout out to the Association of Black Women Historians and ASALH and NCBS, the professional organizations where these scholars are grounded. Deborah Gray White wrote in Telling Histories, Black Women Historians in the Ivory Tower, that memoirs provide a how-to survival guide. So I've been on this journey for, let's see, 2007, you know, a number of, what is that, a decade, over a decade. But this particular wellness journey I started in 2013, and I started connecting intellectual history to mental health using these memoirs as a guide. And so along the way, I started gathering, you know, I'm a shout out again to Auburn Avenue. I'm a wannabe librarian. Like, I love collecting books, and there was not a database that existed that I could use. So I started to create Africana Memoirs as a database, and gathered these different narratives, gathered up to, now we're up over 500. And many of them, you know, I started to notice these patterns of elder Black women. So for example, Harriet Tubman lived to be in her 90s. Rosa Parks, 92. Catherine Dunham, 96. Marian Anderson, the opera singer, 96. And Leah Chase, who just passed in 2019, a famous chef from New Orleans, lived to be 96. And I was very fortunate in 2018 to, you know, go down to New Orleans to Dookie Chase. And, you know, if you're lucky, right after lunch, Chef Chase just welcomes so many people in her kitchen. And I was very fortunate to meet her in person, such a powerful force. And she really embodied what it meant to age well. You know, here she was at the time, 95, in her kitchen. But if you look closely at this picture, it's really interesting, because one of the things that just surprised me in seeing Chef Chase was that she had Cheetos. I was like, wait a minute, A, you're 96, B, you're a world-class chef. You know, what are you doing eating Cheetos? And that kind of bears out in some of the literature that we, you know, if we're talking about stress management and resilience and longevity, that it's not, you know, a guaranteed, if you eat this, if you don't eat that, that you'll live to be 100, right? It's really more of a holistic understanding of some of the stressors that are there, and how you manage that stress, and how you find balance in your life. And so I learned very powerful lessons from Chef Chase. And so I started initially looking at Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, who, if you've taken African American studies or women's studies, you may know lived to be 105 and a half. She is one of the historical creators of what we now call intersectionality, right? Of someone who was writing about being Black, was writing about being a woman, and how those two intersected in her lives. And so when I started looking at Anna Julia Cooper as a scholar, in this work, I started looking at her as a centenarian, as someone who lived to be, you know, and I was asking, well, how did she live to be 105 and a half and pass away in her house, in her bed, in her sleep, at peace? And so I started to ask questions about stress management and look up the American Psychological Association's definitions of stress, and especially in 2016, the election year leading up to that, but in my own personal experiences, some personal losses starting in 2013, losses, personal losses in my family, and just trying to really figure out how someone like Anna Julia Cooper, who was so prolific, who wrote A Voice from the South by a Black woman of the South and published in 1892, how did she produce that much substantive scholarship while she was teaching, while she was engaged in the community, and still managed to be well? And so in speaking to her great grandnephews, I learned that what they called, you know, Sis Annie wrote every day. And she's pictured here in her Washington, D.C. house in front of her sunroom. And she would go into her sunroom and write every day. And she would garden. And she had card parties, quiet as kept. And so I started to understand that there were certain historical practices, and I teamed up with several scholars, Nasinga Burton, who's at Emory University, and Dr. Kanika Bell, who is at Clark Atlanta University. And Dr. Burton and Dr. Bell and I began to explore this larger question of, from our different perspectives, what it means to age and age well. And so defining stress management, American Psychological Association said people listen to music, there's exercise, prayer, and meditation or yoga. So I started to ask these questions about how Black women in history have managed stress through these stress management practices. And when I started looking at yoga in particular, I realized that yoga is not new to Black women, to African women. And we see it here in the Black Panther. You know, it's right in front of our face if you look at it, right? The lotus pose. And, you know, how do you fly a Wakandan plane? Through meditation with your mind. Also, the Queen of Sheba, if you look in history, Makeda, also known as the Queen of Sheba, in 10th century BCE, there's reference to Ethiopian people doing what we now call in yoga, like sun salutations, right? The Queen of Sheba and her people bow down in prayer to greet the rising and setting sun. And though Makeda didn't write herself, she's referenced in the Bible, the Talmud, the Quran, and the Kebra Nagast. So if you look historically at wellness practices, there is a long history, a cultural history, contemporary history that's part of this story. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through the book, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and some of the questions. But essentially, the book has 3 parts that generate from Anna Julia Cooper's concept of regeneration, that we look backward for wisdom, we look inward for strength, and we look forward for hope and faith. And so using that as a framework, I started looking inward to my healing traditions, to how do we define stress? How do we define yoga? And how is that, how can we find some, you know, aspects of that in historical references? The look backward, what I call historical wellness, are chapters on African American women from enslavement to contemporary times. The look forward is post 1975 toward mental health. So how are these historical practices carried on today? 1975 is the pivotal date because that was the year that Yoga Journal was founded in America, marking the popularity of yoga in the United States. And it also contextualizes what we'll see later in some of those practitioners like Rosa Parks, who we found doing yoga in as early as in 1965. Textual references have her, but there's a picture that we'll see in a minute that you may have already seen that's in the Library of Congress that shows Rosa Parks not only taking yoga, but teaching yoga. So how does someone who just turned 60, someone who's a civil rights and icon, come to do yoga? Well, we learn it's a Black thing. So by the 1970s, there was a heavy popular culture in the United States. So mental health and wellness. So the introduction is mental health, healing, and wellness. And again, here's a picture of my my co-editors for Black Women's Mental Health. And this is an intellectual history of self-care. So I'm using African-American women theorists like Audre Lorde and Layli Maparian, feminist and womanist scholars to shape the concept of what we call self-care. So Layli Maparian talks about self-care having three parts, that there's health, healing, and wellness. So for each of those parts, I unpack that and apply this to look at African-American women's narratives. Audre Lorde says that that self-care is compassionate, that African-American women have been taught and raised to have compassion for everyone else but ourselves. So what does it mean to have, as an African-American woman, compassion for ourselves? And that self-care is political. Just the concept of self-ownership for Black women, of caring for myself, of centering myself, is inherently a political move for women who have been dehumanized, for people who are not considered people, and for those of us who have the audacity to say that we will, reclaim our time. Chapter 1 talks about yoga as self-possession. Again, this concept of self-ownership, and I access Black Women's Health Imperative, which is a national Black Women's Health Imperative, Center for Black Women's Wellness. These are organizations that were founded and grounded in Black women's public health activism. So women like Billie Avery, in the 1970s, gathering groups of women at Spelman College and beginning this formal organizing around health issues. And I also think about the concept of intrapersonal intelligence, that Howard Gardner, that we've got different types of intelligence, different types of genius. And so when we, do the SAT or the GRE, we're measuring only two, like we're measuring mathematical intelligence or linguistic intelligence, but there's also intrapersonal intelligence, self-reflective. There's interpersonal intelligence. There's kinesiology, all of these different types of intelligences that I unpack in this first chapter. And Howard Gardner talks about, one finds this form of intelligence developed in the wise elder who draws upon his own wealth of inner experiences in order to advise members of his community. So I'm looking at these Black women's elder memoirs as narratives of experts who are passing on knowledge and intelligence. So Black women's epistemology, our creation of knowledge. I look at yoga in my work and honor the South Asian yoga traditions, that what we now call yoga is South Asian, is an Indian creation, cultural creation that is in written form with the Sanskrit verses and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that are Sanskrit verses that are guides that were brought in 1893 to the United States by Swami Vivekananda, and then carried on, in writing through B.K.S. Iyengar, Swami Satchidananda, and other yogic guides who created this understanding and trained generations of scholars in the United States, really around the world, in the paths of yoga. And so that includes meditation, devotion, asanas, or the physical postures, service, knowledge, chanting, this way of engaging with the world that, and then there's the 8 branches of yoga, right? You may have heard of Ashtanga yoga, which are the ways that these principles are practiced, right? These paths are followed through principles, personal disciplines, the postures, the breathing, withdrawal of the senses, meditation, and consciousness. And that we have an understanding that these are knowledge creations and cultural creations of South Asia and India. And so I'm telling yoga as an Indian story, that there were gurus, there are journals, there's yogis, there's contemporary scholars like Rupa Singh and Ramya Pucha, and Srina Gandhi. And so there's there's this need to cite Black women, which I do throughout my book. But because I'm studying yoga, I hashtag cite Indian women as well, and center the scholarship that is already existing by Indian and South Asian women in this work. And I trace, again, through Yoga Journal and critical race scholarships. And here I engage my colleague, Tiffany King, who's also an affiliate faculty in African American Studies, who talks about the Black shoals, right? The ways that in her case, African Americans and Native Americans or indigenous people in North America congregate to make meaning outside of predominantly white spaces. In this way, I can speak to the relationship of African yoga, African-based yoga, African-American cultural experiences of yoga that honor the Indian roots of yoga, but also place alongside that the African roots of yoga, in addition to some of the other more popular narratives that yoga is usually kind of gone through. So I talk about yoga as an African story, and that this is Sir Rahotep, who was my yoga teacher. I actually did, even though I'm a beginner in my own yogic practice, I took a 200-hour instructional course in Kemetic yoga, where Sir and Dr. Hoppy in the 1970s, two brothers from Chicago, created this concept of yoga based on African traditions, based on Egyptian principles and Egyptian pyramids and shrines and texts to create, so there's some differences between African yoga and Indic yoga. For example, there's a connection to ancestors. There's the rule of 4 breathing. There's the concept of geometric progression, how our body moves that relates to the ancient practices that are right there if we look at them. So for example, the what's known as the lotus pose, where you're crossing your legs, is the Egyptian seated scribe, right? Geb, the god of earth, or what we call the plow pose, or the Egyptian dancer, is known as the wheel pose. So if you look at North African traditions, they're there. This concept of yoga is there, but there's also East Africa, as I mentioned earlier. Makeda and her people bow down to greet the rising and setting sun. There's West Africa in Cote d'Ivoire or Liberia. The Dan people from ancient Mali and Ghana have in the Yoruba language a concept of Riro, right? The elastic people. And these are traditions that Sir has uncovered to say that it's not simply North Africa that we're talking about. If you look in African culture, African history, it's there. And there's a new movie called Township Yogi that is tracing the practices of yoga today in South Africa. But if you look at the history of South Africa and Zulu traditions in particular that engage dancing, a lot of those new yoga students in Township Yogi are connecting it to their traditional dances of South Africa. So again, there's roots of African yoga that are there if we look for them. In African American culture, it's again pervasive if you're looking at Quincy Jones, Sonny Rollins, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Earth, Wind and Fire. And so even though I'm focusing on African American women in this book, I'm also highlighting the fact that this is an African American tradition. And Jana Long, who is the president of Black Yoga Teachers Alliance, who wrote the foreword to the book, produced a documentary called The Uncommon Yogi, A History of Blacks in the US. And that is the broader aspect of that. African-American yogic history, again, I've gone through some of the archives in the Howard Hilltop and found several references there in the early 1970s, in Ebony magazine in 1960 and 1975. And so when you see pictures of Rosa Parks doing yoga and the elders that I'm looking at, like the Delaney sisters doing yoga, there was a cultural moment where we were centering our own healing. And as you'll see, it wasn't just the West Coast and Hollywood. There's a reference to, a person in West Virginia who wrote in about the story, the 1960s story, who said he's been practicing for 40 years. And so there's a rich tradition that this book is just beginning to uncover. Chapter 2 is talking about managing traumatic stress, where I define stress as in terms of environment. And I have to give a shout out to Sarita Davis in African American Studies as well, who is talking about public health and the environmental issues that impact stressors. It's not simply that Black people are stressed out, it's that these are historical environmental issues that stress us out, that impact our mental health. Chapter 3, I unpack my story, Medica Curator Ipsum, physician, heal thyself. And I'm telling these stories in the beautiful, the ugly, and the healing, in the framework that Patricia Bell Scott uses for her narratives. That there's the beautiful that we have in our own stories. There's the stressors, and throughout this book, I look specifically at sexual assault. As I'm a survivor several times over of sexual violence, that does something to your spirit, it does something to your body, it does something to your mind, and that trauma yoga is definitely important. It is an important part of this narrative. So I include my own story in there, and my healing journey too. I just turned 50. Now I'm going to be 52. Chapter 4, I look at blue zones for Black women, and blue zones are, Dan Buttner talks about the geographies of aging, and there are communities all around the world that have a critical mass of centenarians. And so it's not just one or two people, but if you look in Japan, if you look in Loma Linda, California, Greece, Italy, there are these communities where people are aging well together, and they're called blue zones. So I look at memoirs of centenarians and nonagenarians who created their own blue zones. Anna Julia Cooper, who I mentioned with meditation, Marian Anderson, who lived to be 96 in song, Dovey Roundtree, the Delaney sisters, and Ida Keeling, who's still with us at 105, who started running in her 60s. So we have these practices, these mental health and physical health strategies and spiritual health strategies already on the books if we take time to look at some of these narratives. And so when I'm looking at Black women elders and inner peace, it just, when I started, I was like, this is the corniest thing I've ever heard. I'm literally going to write a book about inner peace. I just can't. I can't with my own self, but I am. I wrote a book on inner peace because there are narratives there. It was in the data that was in the memoirs that Harriet Jacobs, who talks about obtaining peace in this lifetime. The Delaney sisters talk about creating a peaceful home. Eartha Kitt, how to find peace in nature. Rosa Parks, living in peace and harmony socially. Jan Willis, choosing peace over violence. And Tina Turner, moving from pain to peace. That language of peace and inner voice and inner strength and inner agency is there in our narratives as well. So for the sake of time, I won't be able to go through the entire narratives, but I want to just kind of put some images out there. Harriet Jacobs was born enslaved and escaped because her so-called owner was making sexual advances to her, but also threatening to sell her children and put them in the field. And so she escaped and lived for 7 years in the attic of her grandmother's house. And she was literate, so she was writing, and she was writing her actual story, which wasn't published until 1861, But while she was there, she made in her memoir mention 3 times of meditation, that I was meditating. In the Delaney sisters, who lived to be 109 and 104, started doing yoga because when they were in their 60s, their mom was in their 80s, and they said, Mom started to hunch over. And so we started doing this. There was this television program, and we started doing yoga with her. And so this is a picture of them at 101 and 102, I think, in an inverted, a very, advanced pose. Eartha Kitt, of course, an entertainer, musician, and a student actually of Catherine Dunham's, talked about how she used her body, and how she wrote several memoirs. One was To Rejuvenate. So it was specifically how to live long and well from her perspective. Harriet Jacobs, as I said, wrote, again and again, I had traversed those dreary 12 miles to and from the town. And she was walking back and forth, to the plantation. And all the way I was meditating upon some means of escape for myself and my children. My friends had made every effort that ingenuity would devise to effect our purchase, but our plans had proved abortive. And she wrote, her grandmother's former owner condoled me in her own particular way. She said she wished that I and my grandmother's family were all at rest in our graves. For not until then should we feel any peace about us. This good old soul did not dream that I was planning to bestow peace upon her with regard to myself and my children, not by death, but by securing our freedom. And so this is a freedom talk. This is freedom school. This is a literal person talking about having peace in this lifetime, not in the next, and meditating and figuring out how to get that done, how to have freedom for her and her children. The Delaney sisters having our say, here again, references to their poses. So we tend to think of those who are elders and aging as, kind of physically aging. And that's true, we do age, but here they are in very advanced poses. So having a longevity practice, talking about doing yoga Monday through Friday with, every Monday through Friday, that's what they did. So for the sake of time, the next chapter 6, I look at Rosa Parks, Jan Willis, who's actually a religion professor here at Agnes Scott University in Atlanta, and Tina Turner's chanting, that this is the language, exercising, meditation, stretching, visualization, chanting. And here we see Rosa Parks in the bow pose, which again demonstrates that she was not simply doing yoga, but she was teaching yoga at a very high level. And there's reference to in her work having long-standing health issues. She had chronic tonsillitis as a child, and then the stress from the activism, the bus boycott, her continued activism in Detroit with John Conyers, that she had a stomach ulcer, her nerves were bad. So she was doing this literally to save her own life and as part of her community activism. That says here that she was long plagued with stress-related health issues. She took up yoga to become, and also became a vegetarian. So again, looking at that mind, body, and spirit history. Jan Willis, Dreaming Me, African-American women's spiritual journey, Black, Baptist, and Buddhist. Both with Rosa Parks and with Jan Willis's story. I've presented this work at several conferences, and after the talks, inevitably, some younger Black women will come up and say, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you pointed out that Christians can do yoga, because my auntie or my grandmother, or, we have this idea of what yoga is and isn't. And we have Deaconess Rosa Parks and Jan Willis, who is claiming to be Baptist, her Baptist roots from Alabama, and Buddhist at the same time, and holding those two things together, and choosing peace over violence. And then lastly, Tina Turner with her chanting. Now, when I wrote this, Cicely Tyson's book had not come out yet. I had mentioned Cicely Tyson as someone who was a long-living Black woman, but when her book came out, which just came out, she talked about chanting Nam-myo Renge Kyo, which is the Buddhist chant. And she said that I can actually retain my Christianity and chant in meditation. So that was Cicely Tyson as well. I talk about the memoirs being mentors, and there are Southern women like Jessie Norman, who's from Georgia, who writes extensively about yoga, Angela Davis, Alice Walker, these are Southern women, and Donia Irvin, who is the mother of Nell Irvin Painter, who's from Texas, writing about aging and aging well. And her book is actually titled, I Hope I Look That Good When I'm That Old. And so there's traditions of intergenerational, there's professional historians, Nell Irvin Painter. We in higher education are so conditioned to think that unless we're stressed out, we're not working. When someone says, how are you? And if you say, well, something's wrong, you're not like, what is wrong with you? So one of the things that I'm trying to do is institutionalize wellness. That concept that you can live your life and be an academic, live the life of the mind and not go crazy. And we see that with Nell Irvin Painter, who is a distinguished professor at Princeton University, professor of history. And she quit. She says, I'm actually going to still be a historian on my own time, but I'm going to art school. So her memoir is called Old in Art School, a memoir of starting over. And she uses her rich analytical experience as an academic and applies that to creating art and looking at Black art and having a full life that it does. Doing academic work does not require us to lose our minds or our souls for that matter. Again, Patrice Gaines, Pam Grier, Deborah Santana, Jennifer Lewis, Queen Latifah, and Aisha Simmons represent this current tradition, my generation of those who are between 50 and 70, who are, these are all specifically survivors of some sort of sexual violence, who have made wellness part of their advocacy and resistance. Chapter 9 is the purpose of Black women's studies, in that, I say, I earned my degree from the Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies with a graduate certificate in advanced feminist studies from UMass Amherst. From the beginning, I trained as a Black women's studies scholar, and building on Patricia Bell Scott, Gloria T. Hall, Barbara Smith. They said in the first book, but some of us are brave, right? All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. The first collection of Black women's studies as Black women's studies, they said the goal of Black women's studies is to save Black women's lives. And that's what I feel I'm here to do, save my own life first. But this research agenda is really to create an understanding of the foundations of Black studies, of women's studies, and Black women's studies, all of which turned 50 at the same time I did. And in conclusion, I put forth the kind of culmination of my ideas of this thinking towards a philosophy of Africana yoga, and coining the term Africana yoga. What does that mean? That it's a yoga that is African-centered, that is feminist womanist, that is regenerative. It looks, because we love to use these 25-cent words in academia, like, oh, it's a generative conversation. Well, I'm saying that I'm having a regenerative conversation, because it's not just what we're talking about now and the future. It's that historical part that we're looking backward, inward, and forward, that it's inclusive, that there are fat Black bodies who do yoga, disabled bodies that do yoga, trans Black women's bodies that do yoga. I cite Janet Mock purposefully in all of my work, and there's an excellent documentary on Polly Murray that just came out that gave me life when the gender reference to Polly Murray is they, that was what they were trying to get to in their lives. So being inclusive means that you that me as a cis normative, like heterosexual ish, like this is the perception of what, you know, just like you can pass for color, you can pass for gender and sexuality, and I could just be exclusive. But I'm very purposeful about pushing myself, and my transgender students help me with this, to make sure that we're holding, everybody needs to be held accountable for being more inclusive in this work. So as I do Black women studies, I include trans Black women as well, that it is creative and collective, that it is authentic. There is no one way to be a Black woman. The Black woman that I am now is not the Black woman that I was in my 20s or my 30s. That my freedom doesn't look like your freedom, and your freedom may not look like mine. That each of these experiences are authentic, that you get to decide what type of yoga you want to do. That it is narrative, that we are natural storytellers, that is our culture, and that it is activist, that just the concept of talking about health from the perspective of wellness instead of the perspective of illness, assuming, as Du Bois did, that Black women are human beings that have problems, but that are not a problem. That it's these are the ideas that I'm just fleshing out. I end the book with music meditation. These are, you know, all of the musicians who that inspire me. I created an Africana yoga playlist. One is a calm playlist, a slow playlist, and the other is a banging for just when you feel like releasing everything in your body. And I came to yoga through dance, that my grandmother was a dancer at the Howard Theater. My mother was a dancer. And when I first started doing yoga, taking yoga classes in graduate school, along with cardio kickboxing, because I used to I like to sit peacefully and I like to kick things. But I came through yoga stretching, you know, through dance, and it was very familiar to me. And music is a part of the African yoga tradition as well. And then lastly, I finished this book in 2019 and sent it off to the press. And then my first semester, or my second semester, my first year as department chair, COVID hit. And rightly so, the Black Lives Matter protesters amped up through through this, you know, we're still going through this now. So how we have all of these different traumas going on at once, really focusing on this book is helping me get through. And so I turned to Sonia Sanchez, and her piece is a haiku song, and I'll end here so we can get to the discussion. I hope I haven't talked too long. They haven't turned off the screen yet, so I guess I'm okay. But Sonia Sanchez says, "It'll get better, it'll get better, it'll get better, it'll get better. It'll get better, 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 it'll get better." And that her poetry and her chanting, and I've been fortunate enough to be around her in person, to teach a class on her, and she visited, that there is a way to do this work that is life-giving. And she says, "Come, let us flush the world's flesh with peace and live." So I will stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to the discussion as it comes.
Dr. Evans, thank you so much for that. It was powerful. It was personal, and you know, I know I'm better for it, and I appreciate you sharing your work with us, getting this early peek into your new book. And as always, Auburn Avenue, there it is. There it is.
I love it. So beautiful. This is my baby, y'all.
That's right. And as always, Auburn Avenue has done a phenomenal job. Mr. Cox has been filling the chat window with references as Dr. Evans making them in real time. So we want to invite folks to type questions into the Q&A. We have some time remaining, and I will start. And something you said early on really struck me. The reality that in many ways Black women are taught not to engage in self-compassion. And if we think about things that have happened in the media recently, it's almost as if there's no safe space for Black women, and perhaps with the exception of the space that they're able to create for themselves. And that's a little dire, but that's what came out of my mouth. I wanted to ask you, how does one find their way to their own self-compassion when the world seems incessantly to seek to deny them that?
I came to this work through sheer desperation.
Mm.
As I said, I'm a survivor of several different types of violence, sexual violence, definitely cultural violence, structural violence. And so all of these things came to a head in 1994 when I started college. So my first year in college was the first time, and I didn't start college until I was 25. And I went to St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a very expensive private school. And I was, for the first time in my life, feeling like I had a safe space. It was a world of books. I was always a geek. I loved books, and I was finally in college, but I was working and I was driving. So it was so difficult for me that first year I had an ulcer. Like, I got an ulcer. And ulcers are not necessarily caused by stress, but they're exacerbated. And so I finally figured out, I had to transfer schools and, figure that out. And then things were okay. And then, graduate school, more stress. Then things were okay. Then becoming a faculty member, more stress. Then, and it's like, okay, so then I got tenure. Whew, I got tenure. I'm a tenured faculty. What? More stress. Right. Even getting, and so what occurred to me is that there is no such thing as a safe place for Black women. There is no safe space for us that will be static. So even though I didn't have an ulcer, when I was, in my ninth year as department chair, seventh, eighth year as department chair, I had a miscarriage. My father and my mother died within 6 weeks of each other. And I had all sorts of stuff going on. And I started to get these tension headaches. And I was like, so I learned how to manage my stress enough to where I didn't have a full-blown attack, but it was out of sheer desperation that I started to turn to figure out how to do this in a way that would weather all of the different storms. And so I came to this work out of sheer desperation, out of sheer frustration, that I just can't sustain this level of stress. I mean, I was crying every day. I was crying every day, right. Every day. My first year as a faculty member, but there were just so many things that kept happening. And so I learned to create compassion for myself out of exhaustion. And then I started to surround myself with, which I'd always done, and I say that if I'm in a room full of Black women, I'm guaranteed not to be the smartest one in the room. Right. And so I just surrounded myself with Black women, particularly elders. And, and this is not to say that these spaces are necessarily safe or perfect, because we can do a special kind of damage to ourselves, right, as Black people. But to seek out those who had some little puzzle piece that was helpful for me. And so just find what works for you and leave the rest. There is no formula. I mean, like I said, Leah Chase was eating Cheetos. So there's no formula
Right.
to health or joy or happiness. But once you have it, there were some things that Kanika Bell, she did a survey of 50 Black women mental health professionals, and simple things like saying no. No, I'm not, and without explanation, no. And Billy Avery says, no is you know what we need to do is such and such. No. Well, you know what you need to do. No. Because Black women stay saving the world and we are praised for it. But in the meantime, we're being crushed. So just being able to say no. What Whoopi Goldberg said the other day to to some foolishness is that talk, 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 talk. She was like, okay. Being able to, like, it takes two people to argue, not argue with foolishness. And that's not to say that we don't fight. That's not to say that we don't check or correct. But if all you're doing is running around, and Toni Morrison said this very well, the purpose of racism is to keep us from our work. So I am very focused on my work, and that came out of necessity, that I can't run around after every fire to try to put out every fire. I will say no, thank you. Okay, I will create boundaries around the parameters of what I will and don't do. And I've learned that if I don't do that, then I just spiral down into running around after everybody's agenda, and I lose my ability to hear my inner voice.
Thank you for that. So there were two questions, and Alicia just said you answered the question that she just posted in the chat, and the first question actually comes from Shara B, and I think you answered that as well. How did doing this work inform how you navigate the academy? And you and I are both leaders of, shall we say, potentially besieged units, as it relates to the politics of the United States. And whenever I talk to you, you always have a very grounded perspective. And I'm not sure if you wanted to say anything else about how this work has helped you as director. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is my guide. I'm going to pull out this one, this book here, Black Women in the Ivory Tower. That's how I learned to be an academic. And so when I don't know something, I'll go back to the history of higher education and how women like Mary McLeod Bethune and Septima Clark, who was community-based, Bethune. And my playbook is from this. So when people are coming at me saying, well, you have to do this, or you should do this because then that will make you good enough. Or, so I don't have imposter syndrome. There's nobody that can convince me I don't belong here. That's not to say that I don't have insecurities about my work, or I'm not nervous about my work, but I know what higher education is because I learned from the best. So anybody who would dare to critique me really isn't fit to carry Anna Julia Cooper's books. And until you know all that history, you can't come for me. In terms of administration, it's the same thing. That's my playbook, that there are individual personalities in students, in parents, like in department chair in particular is a beast, And so here again, I'm part of a collective of Black women department chairs. It's called Chair at the Table, that I created a networking and mentoring group. So if I don't know from a Black woman's perspective, if what I'm doing is right or on point, or if the ancestors would approve of what I'm doing, I go to my collective and say, listen, here's what's up. This is going on, this is going on, this is going on. And from people who are in the particular position of the administrative role of department chair, which is different than faculty, which is different than being an administrator,
right?
That mix of how to balance, simple things like how do you do your damn email? How do you manage email from administrators and from faculty and from students and from deadlines and, prospective students? And so my playbook is managing the academy from the perspective of the ancestors. And then, if that works out, great. If it doesn't, at least I know I'm doing something for the way that that makes sense based on the information that I have. And that's not, and being okay with people not liking me.
That's right.
I don't like you. Okay. This is where the no and okay. Well, you know, you need to do this. No. Okay. No, no and okay.
Mm.
No. Okay.
Okay. Got it. We have a question from Moses, who is interested in the gardening, this idea of yoga gardening, yoga gardens, and where were these yoga gardens? Do you have any more information on gardening and yoga gardens that you might share?
Excellent. Moses Massenberg.
Yeah.
Hey, dude. You know I'm looking for you. Okay, anyway, I'm sorry. This is Facebook Live. I'm gonna clean it up. Hey, dude, it's so good to hear from you, Moses. Anna Julia Cooper, there's some in the Howard University archives. Her papers are digitized in the Moreland Spingarn papers. And if you look in there, there's some gardening. And I know, you know, reach out to Lopez Matthews, call Lopez Matthews at Moreland Spingarn, and he can at least get you to that picture of Anna Julia Cooper gardening. And so that's really, let's see, are there any other references? Jana Long in her introduction mentions canning, you know, that there are knitting circles, there are gardening circles, whatever. There's people who run, but yeah, there's different ways to do. It's not necessarily self-care as we envision it, right? Going to the spa day and all that. Although I miss the spa. I can't wait for that to be over because I need to go back to my spa. But yes, gardening, Anna Julia Cooper, Lopez.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We have a question from Morgan. Interesting question. How can I start to find a path of meditation and peace now being really young and still in school? What would you say to Morgan?
I would say go to blackwomensyogahistory.net and go to resources. And if you click there, there's a whole bunch of information. And I think it's in the top right corner, there's a red button, YouTube videos, and just scroll through to see what it looks like to do yoga. There's some meditations, there's all sorts of, there's sound meditation, where, and search a lot. It's like what I tell my students, this is all about research. You have to survey 50, 25, 10 different sources to find out what resonates with you, because someone will say, here, this is meditation. And it may be like the calm meditation music may put you to sleep. You may not like that, right? So you may be like Ida Keeling, who started running. She started running because both of her sons, who are Vietnam vets, were murdered, and so she was dealing with so much grief. So her meditation practice, how she started feeling better, came from when she started running 5Ks. So I would say, first, find what helps you breathe, you know, and second, if we're talking about meditation at its core, which is not necessarily quieting your mind or blanking your mind, but just being able to sit with yourself, like Maya Angelou says, finding home in yourself. 5 minutes a day. Try, and sometimes, you know, if you have roommates, if you're young, if you're a caretaker, if you've got kids, it may be the bathroom. It may be taking 5 minutes just to sit in the bathroom, which you may not have that luxury, 5 minutes, but 3 minutes, 1 minute into a daily practice. You know, Jonathan, you know, quiet as it's kept, Curtis Bird, his meditation is better than mine. He's so routine every night, stretching, breathing, relaxing, and it makes a huge difference. So short answer, 5 minutes a day to breathe. And there's the shallow breathing, there's the mid-level breathing, and there's breathing from your core, from your hips, from your soul. Start there and learn, just do what helps you breathe.
And thank you for that. Maybe we can put our heads together on this next question. It's from Melly. I apologize if I mispronounced your first name. She says, as an elderly Black woman in college, how do you, meaning herself, live with instructors who refuse to acknowledge, for instance, the accommodations for disabled people who attend GSU? There's so much negative vibes that come through and shows through. It's almost, this is what she says, it's almost too overwhelming. And sometimes I feel like it's not worth it, exclamation point.
Mm-hmm.
How would you tell a person to cope with this and these evil vibes?
Evil? You mean there's evil? Higher education evil? You don't say.
Yeah.
First and foremost, go to the text, right? Whatever policies are required by the university must be upheld, right? So whatever disabilities, there's a whole a center to accommodation center.
Can I jump in really quickly?
Yeah, please.
It's access.gsu.edu. That's the GSU Access and Accommodation Center, Melanie. If you haven't been there, I'd strongly encourage that you go, and as Dr. Evans is saying, share the text, share your experience. Okay, Stephanie, I pulled up the website. I just want to make sure.
No, that's perfect. It is. It's the accessibility to. So find out what, because a lot of what Black Women in the Ivory Tower and the Black Women Studies has taught me is to look at the structures, to look at the guidelines, and make sure that you're, and I was an adult reentry student too. I didn't start until I was 25. But just as if you're talking about being elder, Anna Julia Cooper didn't earn her Ph.D. until she was 65 years old. And she lived to be 105 and a half. So it's never too late. It may be overwhelming, but go to not just the individual people, but the text of the requirements for access. Right. And if you're looking at the text and you go to one person and they are not accommodating, then you go to the text and you find the next person down the line, and you create, making sure to loop in. And it's not necessarily like, I'm gonna tell your boss. People love that game. I'm gonna tell you, it's okay, I'm not getting necessarily what I need here. Can this other person, two people, help us work with what policies are in place to make sure I'm getting what I need? And then, so part of it is the institutional part, and then part of it is just not feeling overwhelmed and not giving up. And that's where Anna Julia Cooper's story is for you. Nell Irvin Painter's Old and Art School is for you. Dovey Roundtree, Justice Older Than the Law, who she went to law school, and then she went to get her degree at Howard in theology. So that there is this thing called lifelong learning. And even though these institutions seem evil and seem like they are constructed just to break your spirit, and it may in fact seem like the world is that way, I have, through any means necessary, literally counseling, cardio kickboxing, but using Black women's writing as a guide has kept me from being hopeless. It's made me more determined, and it's given me conviction that I will continue to do what I need to do and get what I need to get.
Thank you for that. You up for two more questions?
Yeah, man.
Okay. Let's see.
I love this work. I'm telling you.
Right. Let's see. Here's one from Inga Willis. Thank you, Dr. Evans. Via the African Black woman's lens, she says, I feel seen. The ambitious woman mostly suffers in the loudest of silence. I've recently recovered from massive fibroids due to overwhelming stress and reread Yogananda in my recovery. I'm just starting my yoga practice, and she is a busy HBCU tech exec. Are there any teacher yogi recommendations for a Black woman starting her work towards radical self-care with yoga in Atlanta? How do we practice, she asked, during COVID? And she says something about Howard University. We're gonna skip over that.
Listen now. Don't be like that. I was born at the Freedmen's Hospital, 3rd floor, what is now Howard University's hospital. So don't be talking about my
You know, we got beef. We got beef. We got beef.
You know what? Don't get me started on that. Anyway, okay, focus. I'm just starting my yoga practice in Atlanta. So if you go to yoga skills, again, if you go to yoga, Black Women's Yoga History.net and click resources, there's a whole resource page. So there's books, there's videos. If you want to take classes, there are classes there. Yoga skills is the Kemetic yoga teacher certification. And now because we're online, there's also all sorts of yoga green book, Black Girl and all sorts of online communities. There are Facebook groups and Black Yoga Teachers Alliance. If you're interested in even thinking about, getting some sort of certification, but if that resource page has a whole bunch of information for those who are beginning or those who are experienced and want to take it to the next level. There's all sorts of links just right there. BlackWomen'sYogaHistory.net, click resources.
Okay, and I just want to say too, there's this little bit too much Howard University activity here. This is an academic environment. This is not a pep rally. So
what? Okay, listen.
I'm sorry, the Kennebrew, all these other people jumping up with this Howard stuff.
Hit
no,
dog
okay.
holler. Listen, hit dog holler.
No, listen.
Hit dog holler. Why you?
No, I'm just saying.
Why you? What do you have against?
You're the presenter. I'm the moderator. Can I do my job, please? This is what I'm talking about. All right. Okay. Let's see. This Kennebrew person from something about HU.
What?
So Kennebrew, Kay Kennebrew is interested in thoughts about recent phenomena such as trap yoga. Or any other breakout cultural interactions with yoga as one, gateways to increase introduction participation in yoga and meditation practices in underrepresented communities or among people who likely felt uninvited to the space. And two, is it a sustainable business model for Black and Brown yogis?
Excellent question. So in the book, I talk about all the iterations of yoga and how Black people doing yoga and trap yoga and let your booty do that yoga doesn't release us from the responsibility to understand when we use the term yoga, there is a possibility that we will be contributing to the cultural appropriation of yoga industry, right? Which is saying namaste. Yeah, namaste, the namaste, I mean, without taking seriously the need to understand what you're saying, to understand the sacredness and spirituality of saying something like namaste or om, like understanding the Hindi roots of it, understanding the politics of it, what's going on in India right now. And there are scholars like Arundhati Roy who are writing about the politics of radical roots, radical politics, conservative politics that are hurtful. So there's all of these things that we must be accountable for because we call out other cultures that are appropriating our stuff without appreciation. So doing Black yoga and not taking seriously the need to be reverent of Indian and South Asian culture. And, so not just using it as a business model, not just, being mindful that if you're doing these things, it's kind of what bothers us when people take Black culture, right? That being said, there are some really interesting conversations that I uncover in the book about Indian Blackness. So, you got Kamala Harris and what it means to be Black. And there are like BKS Iyengar said that he didn't know, he was Black until he traveled to the UK and the United States and couldn't get into segregated hotels and things like that. So he saw his yoga practice as being, an anti-colonial force, a force against racism. And so when we're saying, what should we do with trap yoga? Should we do trap yoga? Can we make a business doing trap yoga?
Mm.
Those are important questions that you want to reach out to figuring out. Yeah, oh, someone just posted Ona Hawk yoga. Yeah, there's a lot of good working yoga instructors. And again, I'll say, reach out to Black Yoga Teachers Alliance, to Yoga Skills, reach out to people who have been doing this for a decade and find out what's working for them. But take time to do that study, so it's not just being a part of capitalist consumption where we're doing everything else. Like, how can I make this marketable? How can I make money off of this? How can I be an IG, or OnlyFans star, with this hot yoga stuff? That's not where I'm coming from. And there are problems with that.
Okay, thank you.
But that being said, there's no reason why you can't make a living doing the work that you were meant to do, doing healing work. And it should be fun, and there should be music.
Mm. Okay. Thanks for that. I just want to say there's a lot of, this is not Howard University Alumni Association program.
You brought all of that.
I just wanted to say to all these people typing in the chat, threatening me, implied threats. So I think that there was a follow-up question from Ms. Bennett about the list of books that you mentioned. So I wanted to say that what will happen is, it takes a few days. Auburn Avenue will edit this video and place the video on its YouTube channel. So I'm going to ask, if possible, if Auburn Avenue could put the link to its YouTube channel in the chat so that people will be able to have that. And then you can just go to the channel and just watch the video and pull everything off of the video for your reference there, Ms. Bennett. So
shout out to Howard University History Department and the Moreland Spingar and Africana Carr at Howard University. I only said that because, listen, whatever you pay attention to grows. If you keep saying Howard University, this is going to be a Howard University.
I'm going to talk to my colleague, Lakita Burnett Bailey, who helped organize this series about what has happened, what has transpired this evening. Let's see. So we're pretty much out of time here, and I wanted to see, first of all, I want to thank you again. I wanted to thank Auburn Avenue again, the Multicultural Center, and William Brito for his support. And as you mentioned, my colleague, Lakita Burnett Bailey, who is phenomenal and has done a great job pulling this together. And before we end, I wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to share, any important takeaways from tonight's session that you wanted to share.
Well, first, thank you for the work that you do, and thank all of my colleagues in African American Studies, home away from home with Mukungu and Moja and just all of the, if I don't name somebody, Mohab, it's so crucial to know that I have Leah Bascom. If I have another base, right? That is the base that I was raised in. So thank you so much. As you know, as being a department chair is so difficult and challenging, and always, but in these times more than most. I would just say that, our work is freedom work, and freedom is a human right. We have the right to be free. We have the right to be well. And that is a very radical concept when everything that points to Black people, to women, to Black women in particular, is that we are to be the mules of the world. We are to serve everyone else to our own demise. That's a successful life for a Black woman, is to drive ourselves into the ground. And if we don't do that, then we've somehow betrayed
Mm.
our role in life, our purpose in life. And again, Anna Julia Cooper, who writes about service and social justice, that it's not what she calls some sort of Pollyanna like notion. The concept of service is not to be used, but it is to serve the purpose. And I'm finding so much joy in this work and really relief in this work, that it's possible to do social justice work and the work of purpose in a way that does not, that allows you to not just have self-expression, but self-preservation. And that may be a disappointment to some people, and that it may not look like what other people want it to look like. But, and I will say this is in honor of women who didn't make it to be elders, right? Women like Audre Lorde, who passed of cancer. So it's not simply, we were not meant to survive. It's not simply caring for ourselves only so that we can age, because we live in America. There's no guarantee that I'll live very much longer. And I say this in the end, that the purpose is not to live to be an old age, and not do, say everybody no to everybody. The purpose is to build communities of blue zones for Black people, where we are centering the concept of care and wellness, and that is resistance.
Mm. Thank you for that. So before we go, your social media and where can we buy your book?
Oh, yes, I should probably say that. Yes. Thank you to SUNY Press. If you do go to blackwomen'syogahistory.net and click book, the hardcover is out now, and it's on sale for the hardcovers. Is usually library copies are $97. Until April 13th, SUNY Press has provided a 50% discount on the hardcover. It's also on sale for electronically for $19.22 at Google Play, Amazon, and all the links are there. If you go to that website, all the links are there. And yes, buy the book. It's a beautiful book. I love this book. It is giving, some people are like, oh, you killed it. This work killed it. It's like, no, this work is giving, it's life-giving, it's giving us life. It's giving me life. So definitely get it for you. And it'll be out in paperback in the summer. I'm anticipating in the summer. So you can get that, because I know people like the books.
Well, thank you, Dr. Evans. Thank you, Auburn Avenue. Thank you, Multicultural Center. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and tuning in. And even thank you, all these folks from Howard as well. And we will see you next time. If you give me 1 second, I will tell you about our next presentation. And you would think that I would have it available here. But we don't have a presentation next week, I believe. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure Lakita Burnett Bailey will tell me. But we will post it. I don't want to hold anyone else, but we will post it shortly. Give me 1 second, I'll pull it right up. I just want to make sure, because it's a great series. And our next session is March 17th. Our next session is March 17th with the one and only Golden Star Muhammad from the College of Education, award-winning scholar who's doing phenomenal work around Black youth in schools and literacy practices. Her title is Cultivating Genius and Joy, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Education. Phenomenal.
Hey, Dr. Goldie, yes.
That Dr. Goldie, no doubt. So thank you all very much. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.